Well, the news broke recently that a Carnival cruise line is moving its berth from Melbourne to another location in order to avoid extra fees and taxes that have been imposed by the Victorian Government. Victoria, of course, is both the highest taxing and the highest in debt of all of the Australian states simultaneously, so this appears to be just another symptom of a government that is trying to figure out how to make ends meet. Joining me to talk about this and the wider tax and revenue problem in Victoria is Victorian MP David Limbrick MLC. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Aussie Wire.
Thanks for having me.
Now, this story, on the one hand, caught me off guard. I hadn't quite thought that they would be raising revenue in these sorts of ways, but when you look into the numbers, it really was a very substantial hike in the cost that these cruise lines would have to bear if they wanted to berth in Melbourne and berth in Victoria. Are you surprised by the response from the operator to just say, you know what, we're out, we're not doing this?
Not really at all. They've given us a wide berth, quite literally. When you raise taxes, that has consequences in the form of altering human behavior. That's why they raise taxes on cigarettes, to try and disincentivize people from smoking. Or that's why they have taxes on alcohol, to disincentivize people from drinking alcohol. And in this case, they've disincentivized a cruise ship from docking in Melbourne. When you raise taxes, sometimes they hit a threshold point where it just becomes uneconomic, or alternate means to get that tax just don't work. In the case of the cruise ship, it's quite obvious. They've just done a calculation and said, look, it doesn't make economic sense for us to berth here. Yeah. In the case of other things like tobacco, for example, they've raised taxes so high that the black market has stepped in, and then they don't get taxation from that. And I think this is like a real life application of the Laffer Curve. And for your viewers that aren't familiar with it, it means if you've got a 0% tax rate, you get no tax. If you've got a 100% tax rate, you get no tax, because no one's going to do anything if they don't earn anything from it. And somewhere in between is your maximal tax revenue. And what they've done in the case of the cruise ships, they've raised the tax to the point where raising the tax doesn't actually increase tax revenue. It's going to lower it, because no longer does this economic participant want to play ball anymore.
So what does this say about the situation of the finances in Victoria and the options that the Victorian government is having to look at if they're going to these lengths just to raise revenue?
I think it clearly points to the fact that we're overtaxed. We're one of the highest taxed, we're the highest taxed state in the country. And there's a limit to what governments can do to raise taxes, because they will cause economic effects. So if they raise taxes too high on payroll tax, businesses won't start up here. There won't be jobs here. If they raise other taxes, people might move into state. If they raise berthing taxes, then we'll get less tourism. So there's limits, and clearly we should be looking at what we can do to cut taxes, because that will increase economic activity. Clearly, and this is something that people often overlook, raising taxes doesn't necessarily increase revenue. And in this particular instance, we've got a very dramatic example of it. If they had have lowered taxes, potentially, because this is a transaction tax, they could have actually potentially raised taxes. And this was brought up during the stamp duty inquiry that I got up earlier in the year as well. It was suggested that lowering stamp duty by a couple of percent may not actually decrease revenue, because you would incentivize more transactions to happen, because revenue is not just a function of the tax rate, it's also a function of the number of transactions. This berthing tax is similar. It's not a tax on income, it's a tax on every time you want to dock. And so it's a similar sort of situation. And clearly in this case, they've gone too far. The operator says, no, don't want to do that, and they're out.
So taxation is one side of the equation, obviously, but spending is also another. And we're seeing a lot of news coming out of Victoria of massive infrastructure projects being either behind schedule or being delayed or suspended, big arguments with the federal government over funding and co-funding. We've also seen the cancellation of the Commonwealth Games, ostensibly for financial reasons. Of course, that's been devastating for the athletes involved and for a lot of the rural communities. As a libertarian and someone who believes in low taxation, I'm not against the cancelling of the Games, because I am against the use of taxpayer money. But that deal is done, that's been done. We just have to deal with the consequences of that. A very live question is whether the Victorian government should continue spending on things like the Formula One. Now, the Formula One happens to be the only sport that I actually follow. So this is a matter very dear to my heart, and I love the fact that we do have a Formula One Grand Prix in Australia, but I don't believe taxpayers' funds should be spent on it. Where do you sit on this? Is there enough of a benefit coming out of the Formula One, do you believe, to justify this kind of government spending, or should they be tightening the belt on things like the F1 as well?
Look, firstly, I'd say I've got nothing against F1. I think that, it's a great sport. If people are interested in watching it and want to participate, that's wonderful. But yes, I agree with you. This shouldn't be something that taxpayers should be investing in. It's not. Governments are not good at making investments. They waste so much money. You mentioned the Commonwealth Games. They've wasted. It's looking like at least $500-600 million. We'll wait and see till when the inquiry's over how much it actually is. They waste money all the time. If it was such a good investment, why isn't the private sector interested? Why can't they get more sponsors? And what sort of disincentives do we have in Victoria to hold the Formula One Grand Prix? Maybe there's like excessive taxes that would disincentivize. I'd be much more inclined for the government to look at how can they lower taxes and make it easier for the Grand Prix to be here, rather than subsidising it and picking and choosing winners with sports.
Very true, and certainly as the cost of living bites even harder, I can only think that these sorts of issues are going to start to come to the fore more and more as taxpayers begin to ask serious questions about why am I paying for that through my taxes, in addition to obviously paying for their own cost of living. Well, David Limbrick, thank you so much for your time. You're very generous with it here on the Aussie Wire. We're very grateful, and we'll touch base with you again.
Thanks for having me.